In the heart of Los Angeles, the courtroom was bustling that morning, the murmurs of anticipation barely masking the tension in the air. This wasn't just another routine hearing. Today, all eyes were on Tiffany Halstead, a wealthy socialite known more for her lavish lifestyle and reckless behavior than any kind of moral compass or awareness. Tiffany's presence had already stirred the air. Her usual late arrival, her extravagant designer attire, and her casual demeanor had everyone in the room talking. But this was no ordinary day at the courthouse. Today she was about to face someone who wouldn't be intimidated by her wealth or privilege. Judge William Grant, in his mid-50s, stood out in the legal community as a fair but stern figure. Respected for his sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach, he had earned a reputation as someone who would not let the trappings of wealth or status cloud his sense of justice. He wasn't here to coddle anyone, and Tiffany's case was about to challenge that conviction. The courtroom fell silent as Tiffany, in her usual style, sauntered in late and unapologetic, her oversized sunglasses making a statement even before she removed them. She had the air of someone who didn't care about the seriousness of the proceedings. Tiffany was oblivious to the looks of disapproval from those around her as she made a spectacle of herself, draping her designer handbag over the bench like it was a trophy. Her lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to keep up but seemed to fade into the background, attempting to minimize the scene she was causing. As Judge Grant entered the room, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. His presence commanded attention, his calm yet imposing demeanor a stark contrast to Tiffany's entitlement. The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and Tiffany hesitated, rolling her eyes and sighing before standing. It was clear she was unimpressed by the formalities of court. As the judge took his seat, he began the session with professional detachment, reviewing the charges against Tiffany. The case seemed simple enough, a few parking violations, but the more serious issue was an incident where Tiffany's reckless driving had endangered the life of a pedestrian. Tiffany, however, was not ready to take this seriously. Instead of facing the gravity of the situation, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and visibly rolling her eyes. Every moment was a display of her growing indifference. Tiffany's lawyer leaned in, likely trying to get her to act more appropriately, but Tiffany waved him off with a flick of her hand. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Tiffany's arrogance escalated, but Judge Grant remained stoic, his eyes scanning the case file with the utmost professionalism, ignoring her blatant disrespect. The tension in the room grew with every passing moment, though Tiffany seemed entirely oblivious to the storm she was stirring. When asked to confirm her identity, her response was flippant, her tone laced with disdain. "Yeah, that's me," she said, barely glancing up. Judge Grant's voice broke through the tension like a calm river cutting through a storm. He reminded Tiffany of the decorum expected in his courtroom, but Tiffany, undeterred, smirked and offered him sarcastic compliance. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. Judge Grant, unmoved by her attitude, calmly advised her to adjust her tone. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened. Even those who had seen countless hearings knew something was brewing. Tiffany, however, continued to disregard the seriousness of the situation, further dismissing her actions and the consequences that came with them. When Judge Grant began to lay out the specifics of the charges, Tiffany's defiant behavior only escalated. "Honestly, it's just some dumb parking tickets and what? Someone got scared because I hit the gas too hard," she said dismissively. "This is a waste of time." At this point, the judge's calm demeanor gave way to a more pointed warning. "I would advise you to choose your words carefully," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable weight that had the entire room leaning forward. But Tiffany, still oblivious, shrugged it off, offering a half-hearted response. "It's true," she muttered. "It's not like I hurt anyone." Judge Grant, however, was not deterred. His silence spoke volumes, and the courtroom hung in suspense. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again, this time with a clear edge of authority in his voice. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" he asked. His tone was steady, his gaze unflinching, even as Tiffany remained defiantly aloof. She scoffed, "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, clearly underestimating the gravity of the situation. Judge Grant, however, wasn't about to let her get away with this level of disregard. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands in front of him, and addressed the room. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Halstead," he said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. "The charges against you include reckless driving and endangering a pedestrian's life." At this point, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Tiffany's flippant attitude was no longer being tolerated, but what Tiffany failed to recognize was the growing sense of accountability around her. Judge Grant, in his unwavering calm, continued to explain the severity of the incident. The pedestrian she had endangered, Mr. Edward Lopez, a 67-year-old retired teacher, had been crossing the street legally when Tiffany accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. He required medical attention and was still experiencing pain. Tiffany's defiance faltered for the first time. She glanced briefly at her lawyer, but he simply shook his head, clearly unable to shield her from the consequences of her actions. Tiffany, now less sure of herself, muttered that she hadn't actually hit the man and that he was fine. But Judge Grant wasn't finished. He addressed the court, letting the record reflect the true consequences of her reckless driving. The murmur in the room grew louder as the weight of Tiffany's actions began to sink in. Judge Grant continued, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable gravity. "Do you understand now, Miss Halstead, that your actions caused harm?" he asked. But Tiffany, ever the picture of entitlement, continued to dismiss the seriousness of the incident. It was at this moment that Judge Grant made his decision clear. He had seen enough. Tiffany's actions weren't just about the law. They were about something much more profound, the arrogance of privilege and the refusal to take responsibility. Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze never leaving Tiffany. "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions," he said, his voice now more resolute, "perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany, her bravado beginning to slip away, asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" In a calm, almost methodical manner, Judge Grant began detailing the penalties she would face: substantial fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training. But it wasn't just the fines and mandatory hours that would leave an impression. It was what came next that would change Tiffany's life forever. Judge Grant paused for a moment, his voice unwavering as he announced, "In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then you'll understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement." Tiffany's face went pale as the reality of the sentence began to sink in. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You want me to what?" she exclaimed. "Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." The courtroom was in shock as Tiffany's words reverberated in the silence. For the first time, she was truly confronted with the consequences of her actions, not in the form of just fines or superficial punishment, but in a way that demanded a complete reevaluation of her life. Judge Grant's gaze remained firm as Tiffany's usual bravado faltered. Her lawyer, who had been desperately trying to keep Tiffany grounded throughout the hearing, leaned in and whispered urgently to her. He seemed to be aware of the gravity of what had just transpired. Tiffany, however, wasn't hearing him. Her anger, frustration, and embarrassment took over. "Are you serious?" Tiffany snapped, her voice rising. "You can't force me to do this. I'm not a charity worker." She looked around at the gallery, clearly searching for support, but found only judgment in the eyes of those present. The room was silent, and even Tiffany's lawyer looked like he wanted to shrink into the ground. Judge Grant raised his hand, silencing her outburst, and his voice, though calm, had an edge to it that was impossible to ignore. "Miss Halstead," he said, "it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today. Your actions reflect a lack of understanding and empathy for those who aren't as fortunate as you. You have shown no respect for the law, for the life of Mr. Lopez, or for the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society. This is not about punishment. This is about an opportunity for growth." The entire room held its breath. The weight of Judge Grant's words sank in, especially for Tiffany, who was visibly shaken but too proud to admit it. Her defiance, though still lingering, was now peppered with an undeniable fear of the consequences. As the judge's words echoed in her mind, Tiffany could feel the emotional walls she had so carefully constructed beginning to crack. She had always been shielded by her wealth, her status, and her privilege. The world had catered to her whims, and for the first time, she was being forced to face something that wasn't about her, something far bigger than herself. Failure to comply, Judge Grant continued, will result in a far harsher sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. If you fail to meet your obligations, I will see you back here in this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances. Tiffany remained silent, her face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. But she couldn't argue anymore. For the first time in her life, she was up against something she couldn't simply buy her way out of. The reality of what Judge Grant had just imposed upon her started to sink in. She would have to face this. Judge Grant, after delivering the final details of her sentence, continued in his unflappable tone. You will report to the women's shelter and work with people who have faced hardships that you have likely never imagined. You will hear their stories and witness their lives. Perhaps then, Miss Halstead, you will learn the true meaning of empathy. The courtroom, once tense and silent, now had a sense of finality. Tiffany, for the first time, seemed unsure of herself. Her usual cocky attitude had crumbled. She sat there, stunned into silence as the implications of her sentence swirled in her mind. This wasn't just an inconvenience or a slap on the wrist. This was an opportunity for Tiffany to see the world through a completely different lens. As Judge Grant's gavel came down with a decisive crack, signaling the end of the hearing, Tiffany remained seated. She stared at the table in front of her, her face pale, the earlier defiance now replaced by something far more uncertain. Her lawyer, still shaken, placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer comfort, but Tiffany barely acknowledged him. She was already lost in her thoughts, processing what had just happened. Tiffany didn't look up as the room slowly began to empty, the murmurs of the onlookers rising as people discussed the unprecedented sentencing. Mr. Lopez, the elderly pedestrian she had endangered, stood up slowly from his seat, his arm still in a sling. He moved with a quiet dignity, but there was no anger in his demeanor. Instead, there was a quiet, almost painful disappointment in his eyes that seemed to linger as he glanced at Tiffany. As he passed by her, he looked her way for a brief moment, but Tiffany, unable to meet his gaze, stared down at the table, her usual arrogance gone. This was a moment that would mark her for a long time, though she didn't know it yet. It wasn't just her sentence that had made an impact. It was the realization that, for the first time, someone had seen through her facade and forced her to face the consequences of her privilege. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and cameras had gathered. The buzz around Tiffany's hearing had already become the topic of national conversation. She was no longer just the wealthy socialite known for her extravagant lifestyle. Her name was now linked to a moment of humility and consequence that had caught the attention of the media, and the world was watching. As Tiffany emerged from the courthouse, her lawyer shielding her from the barrage of questions, she was met with flashing cameras and eager reporters shouting questions. Miss Halstead, do you feel the sentence was fair? One reporter asked. Do you have any comment on Judge Grant's decision? For a moment, Tiffany's arrogance resurfaced. She quickly responded with a curt, no comment, as she pushed past the reporters and into the waiting car. Her usual dismissal of the media was present, but as the car doors shut and the noise of the cameras faded, Tiffany slumped back into her seat. The reality of the situation started to settle in. Her life was about to change. Inside the car, Tiffany sat quietly, her usual composure unraveling. She had been forced to face the consequences of her actions in a way that her wealth and privilege had never allowed before. For the first time, she wasn't in control. It was a sobering realization, one that would resonate with her as the weeks unfolded. When Tiffany arrived at the downtown women's shelter the following Monday, she was met with an atmosphere far removed from her usual world. The building, modest and bustling with activity, was filled with people who had faced unimaginable hardship. As Tiffany stepped inside, the hum of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils greeted her. But this wasn't the world of high society and privilege. This was real life, and Tiffany was forced to confront it head-on. A staff member, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense attitude, greeted her. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone friendly but firm. "Welcome, let's get you started." Tiffany's eyes scanned the room, her usual bravado stripped away. She was assigned to help prepare meals, serve food, and clean up afterward. At first, she kept her head down, doing her best to remain as invisible as possible. The hours passed slowly, and Tiffany was acutely aware of how out of place she felt. But as the day wore on, something began to shift inside her. She noticed the gratitude in the smiles of the shelter's guests, the sense of camaraderie among the staff, and the resilience in the stories she overheard. One woman, a single mother of 3, shared her struggles with Tiffany over lunch. "You think you got it all figured out," the woman said, her voice steady but full of years of hardship. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." Tiffany was silent as she listened, her usual words of dismissal held back for the first time. For the first time, she began to see life from a perspective other than her own. As the weeks passed, Tiffany's sentence became more than just a legal obligation. It became a journey of self-discovery, one that forced her to look beyond the confines of her privileged world and confront the realities of life that she had long ignored. At first, Tiffany was reluctant, her mind focused only on fulfilling her community service hours and getting back to the comfort of her lavish lifestyle. But the shelter, the women she met there, and the stories they shared began to chip away at her defenses, forcing her to rethink everything she thought she knew. Each day, Tiffany found herself increasingly immersed in the lives of the people at the shelter. She met women who had lost everything, women who had been forced to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The first few days were difficult for her. She couldn't hide the discomfort that was written all over her face, and she couldn't shake the sense of superiority that still lingered deep inside her. But over time, something changed. She started to listen more than she spoke. She saw the strength in the women who shared their experiences, and she began to understand the value of humility. These women weren't just victims of circumstance. They were survivors, fighters, and fighters often made the best teachers. Tiffany also began to witness firsthand the struggles that many of these women faced on a daily basis. She heard stories of abuse, addiction, and loss, and with each story, her own world seemed to shrink a little bit more. Her encounters with these women who had faced far greater hardships than she ever could imagine, began to give her a new sense of perspective. It was no longer about what she could buy or what she could afford. It was about the struggles and strength of people who had nothing. One of the turning points in Tiffany's journey came when she had a conversation with one of the women at the shelter, a mother of 3 who had been in and out of the shelter for several years. Tiffany had been working with her to organize food donations when the woman opened up about her life. "I used to think I had everything figured out," the woman said. "But life has a way of showing you that what you think matters doesn't always matter." Tiffany, who had grown up with everything handed to her, found herself at a loss for words. She had always been able to buy her way out of problems, but this woman had fought for survival every day. It struck Tiffany deeply. She had always believed that her wealth and privilege gave her a kind of superiority over others, but now she began to see how hollow that mindset truly was. The compassion and understanding that the women at the shelter displayed, despite everything they had lost, humbled Tiffany in ways she hadn't expected. The transformation was subtle at first. Tiffany began asking questions. She started spending more time with the women, listening to their stories without judgment. She helped with tasks without complaint. And bit by bit, she began to understand that true strength wasn't about what you could buy. It was about what you could endure, and how you helped others endure alongside you. As Tiffany's community service came to an end, she was required to meet with Judge Grant again. This time, however, she didn't walk into the courtroom with the same arrogance she had before. She entered with a quiet dignity, her posture more measured, her expression thoughtful. Judge Grant, who had watched her transformation with quiet observation, welcomed her back. The courtroom, which had once seen her as a spoiled rich girl, now saw a woman who had begun to confront her flaws and grow from them. Tiffany stood before the judge, and for the first time, she wasn't there to argue, to fight, or to resist. She was there to thank him. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Judge Grant, who had seen many cases and many people come through his courtroom, nodded slowly, his face softening just a little. "The real thanks, Miss Halstead," he said, "will come when you take what you've learned here and use it to make a difference. That is the true mark of growth." Tiffany left the courthouse that day feeling different. She wasn't the same person who had walked in weeks earlier. Her confidence, once rooted in her wealth and status, had now been replaced by something deeper: humility. She had learned to listen, to understand, and to empathize with people whose struggles had been far greater than her own. The lessons Tiffany learned at the women's shelter didn't just change her. They transformed the way she looked at the world. She realized that no amount of money, no designer handbag, and no privileged lifestyle could ever replace the value of human connection and empathy. In the weeks following her community service, Tiffany became an advocate for the very people she had once ignored. She started volunteering more, using her social media platform to raise awareness for the shelter and other organizations that helped women in need. She also began speaking openly about her journey, using her platform to inspire others to confront their own privilege and take responsibility for their actions. Judge Grant's sentence, though initially shocking to Tiffany, had done something far more important than simply punishing her. It had given her the opportunity to open her eyes to the world around her. It had forced her to confront the ugliness of entitlement, and in doing so, it helped her to reclaim her humanity. The story of Tiffany Halstead's transformation spread far beyond the courtroom. It became a symbol of how privilege, when unchecked, can blind us to the realities of others' lives. But it also showed that change is possible, even for those who seem beyond redemption. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to confront your flaws and take the necessary steps to grow from them. As Tiffany stood outside the courthouse after her final meeting with Judge Grant, she reflected on the lessons she had learned. She had gained a new understanding of herself, of the world, and of the importance of empathy and responsibility. She no longer saw herself as the entitled socialite, above reproach, but as someone who had the potential to make a real difference. The sun was shining brightly overhead, and for the first time, Tiffany felt like she could see clearly. She had been given a second chance, not just by the court, but by life itself. Tiffany's journey was a powerful reminder that real change doesn't come from being told what to do. It comes from the willingness to listen, to see, and to feel the weight of someone else's reality. Her story is one of growth, humility, and the power of second chances. And it serves as a reminder to all of us. No matter how high our station or how deep our privilege, we must never lose sight of the humanity that binds us all together. What will you do today to open your heart and mind to the lessons life has to teach? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and growth.